there has been a spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans. These acts of violence created fear within so many Asian communities, and this is unacceptable. Law enforcement, elected officials, and community leaders must come together to address this major issue. It is my hope that Asian Americans will stand firmly against acts of hate and connect with, as well as collaborate with agencies and people that will stand with them and fight with them to end racism against Asian Americans. Today, I will be speaking with Esther Castillo, project manager of the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation, PCDC. Welcome to the show, Esther. The effects of racism and its impact is so hurtful and traumatizing. I am all too familiar with racism against the African American community. However, my eyes were opened to racism against Asian Americans on 3/16/2021, when 6 Asian Americans were murdered in Atlanta. Esther, please share with me some of the racism that has been occurring within the Asian community.
Well, we can talk more about the recent rise of racism during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we can also talk about the historical racism that Asian Americans have been experiencing in this country. So it depends where you want to talk about. I can talk more. I can talk about both. So the first piece is the more COVID-19 related racism against Asian Americans, and of course, it has a connection to the racist rhetoric that the former president were perpetuating. And calling COVID-19, for example, quote unquote China virus, quote unquote Kung flu, those kind of terms were very, very harmful for the Asian communities. First, it spread misinformation, and I think secondly, it emboldened people and give them a reason to launch anti-Asian attack. Not that they have not been racist, it's just that now that they have a reason to justify their racism. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, definitely we have seen a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes and anti-Asian hate attacks, assaults in Chinatown, in also elsewhere across America. That's an unfortunate fact. And also, this my second point about historical racism is that this is nothing new. Anti-Asian racism is nothing new in America. And as an Asian person, I know firsthand. And as a person working in the Asian community, and it's very heartbreaking to hear, but then people say that, well, we're used to it. And it is so normalized that people just have accepted that being part of their lives, although I don't want to be that person to say that I have accepted it, because this is not something that we should accept. So as a community organizer and advocate, I'm like working to change that fact. People should not accept that. And in terms of more specific examples of the historical racism, we can trace all the way back when the first Asian American came to the United States in the mid-19th century. And a lot of workers coming from China at that time to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And in fact, I think it was last year, I learned it from my family, that my great-great-grandfather, so it was my grandfather's grandfather, was actually kidnapped from China to move to the United States to work as an indentured servant to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And the indentured servitude of Chinese workers is something that very few history books talked about. To be honest, I wouldn't have learned it if my family never told me that history. So my great-great-grandfather ultimately was able to escape to Latin America, married an indigenous woman, and returned to China. And then I actually came to the United States as a first generation immigrant, meaning that in my family I'm the first person who immigrate to the United States. But this is not, it's the first person, you know. But then, yeah. And if you look into some of the history that is now being revealed and talked more about, includes the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that was in effect in starting from 1882 all the way to the 1960s. And then you have during World War II, you have the Japanese internment camp. So Asian Americans have always been casted as the perpetual foreigner, being seen as someone who are constantly who are not from here, who are not American. Despite our contributions, despite some Asian Americans being here second generation, third generation. And that kind of perpetual foreigner status justify the mistreatment and the racism being launched against us. And it's nothing new.
Wow. Now, in the city of Philadelphia, is there an area that has the highest rate of crime against Asian Americans, or is it all over the city of Philadelphia?
As far as I'm concerned, I don't know that there is a specific place where these attacks are concentrated. In March this year, the organization that I work at, PCDC, and I led a report on anti-Asian racism incidents to kind of gather what the extent is in terms of anti-Asian racism locally here in Philadelphia. And we did it during our 2 vaccination days in which people come over to have the vaccination of COVID-19. And during those 2 days, about 700 people came through the door of our community center, and we have gathered 315 reports. And we found that 1 in 7 Asian have experienced incidents of racism.
Wow.
Yeah. So and 1 in 4 know somebody personally who have experienced these sort of attacks. So and if we look at the zip codes, it was all over the place, mostly where Asians are living and working. But I don't think it has. It is particularly concentrated in any places. So that in turn makes a lot of Asian Americans feel very unsafe.
Right, right. It's such a shame. Now, how can we educate others to reduce Asian hate crimes and racism? What can people do not to be a part of this? Because as you indicated, the former president was saying things, and it seemed like it gave people the green light to do the unthinkable. How can we educate people to end racism against Asian Americans?
I think there are some things we can do that is more short term, more immediate, and there are things that require systemic change. So in terms of the more immediate, more personal actions that people can take, I think it can include several things just off of my head. One is that instead of being a bystander, be an upstander. When you see something, when you see somebody getting verbally assaulted or attacked, do something, step in. And there are many bystander trainings given online and locally, so seek them out and educate yourself. And also read and learn about Asian American history. I think a lot of the racist thoughts is a result of ignorance of what Asian Americans have gone through and how Asian Americans occupy the racial landscape in America. So that requires some, it's also a privilege. A lot of these are privilege, right? So I don't want to put everything on the individual, like, oh, you have to do this, you have to do that. And third, I think because of the racism, Chinatown businesses and businesses that are owned by Asians have suffered long before the lockdown. I remember even before the lockdown in March 2020, Chinatown businesses have suffered a lot because of the racist rhetoric that were perpetuated by people in powers and politicians in this country. And so if you look at this, this has been like, at least I would think like 6 months before the lockdown. So the lockdown was March 2020, now it's May. So it has been a long, long time. So if you can seek out the Asian-owned businesses and support them, it has been a really, really hard time for Asian American businesses in this country. And so those are the more immediate personal actions that people can take. But like I said, there are structural reasons why it is hard for people to do those things that we ask, right? And for example, in terms of the Asian American history, if Asian American history were in part of school curriculum, then people don't have to seek them out so hard. And in terms of the bystander training and all this, if people are not so ignorant in general that this kind of education has been more widespread, people don't really necessarily have to seek them out, right? And I also want to point out that anti-Asian racism is part of the makeup of American racism. It's different from anti-Black racism, but it's operating as part of the structure of racism, and it feeds into this larger structure of white supremacy and racism against all people of color in general. So I don't want to separate and say that these are different. So these are different, but they are part of the larger system. I know that some folks feel like, oh, if we are fighting against anti-Asian racism, we're not fighting against anti-Black racism or other forms of racism. The truth is that when we fight when we fight for our freedom as people of color, we're working towards the same goal, right? And I remember Dr. Martin Luther King says something to the extent that we're not free until everybody's free, right? I think it's important to recognize how these different forms of racism are situated in different places, and how our society is designed in such a way that make it hard for different communities of color to see each other's struggles. So then we can always point finger to the other person of color, the other community of color that we have not been exposed to blame each other, instead of focusing and joining forces to fight against white supremacy and racism as a whole.
I agree. Now, do you know if the Asian Americans that you have come in contact with that have been victims of hate crime, do you know if all of them have reported their crime to law enforcement? And is there a lot that are hesitant to do so?
So I want to go back to the report that I mentioned that we did during the 2 vaccination days. So one of the questions was, did you report the incident to the police? And we found that 79% of people did not report it to the police. And we kind of had these casual conversations about why. And we found that a lot of people have this distrust of police. They don't really trust the system. They don't think that the system is built for them, is definitely not built by them. They don't think that this system works to help them. And others said that, well, even if I do so, the police wouldn't care. So why would I try. So that's one layer of it. Another layer has to do with the linguistic barriers. A lot of the Asian American population here don't speak English, or they don't speak English well enough to be at the confidence level where they feel confident enough to talk to somebody in authority, like a police officer. So there are many different layers. Some of them more practical, like, oh, I don't speak the language. The other are more emotional and psychological. They don't think that the system is built for them. And some of them is a result of personal experience. Someone told me, oh, I had done it before, but they ended up punishing me instead of the perpetrators because they didn't believe me. So then I think also within any immigrant community is a very close knit environment. Word spread really fast. So when one incident like this happened, that person will tell everybody in the community, and then there is this general sense that, oh, the police is not really here for us, right? And so I think that kind of explains why a lot of people don't really want to report it to the police. The other misconception is that, oh, it has to be bad enough, right? Or blood has to be spilled, like it has to be really bad
Right,
in order to justify me calling the police, right? So that's the other perception. And also, like, kind of linking to the distrust is the fear for re-traumatization, right? So these individuals the victims already been victimized, and then they have to go through the trouble to call the police and to file the report and all that, and if the police don't really believe them, then they have to be re-traumatized again. So this very scary thing to do. So I'm totally not surprised that 79% of people did not report it to the police.
wow. And that's alarming. And it shouldn't be that way. And I am so glad that we connected, because now Northwest Victim Services and PCDC can now connect to where we're able to serve those of the Asian community, to be able to advocate for them. So when there is a crime, and that's what I do. I'm an advocate first, executive director second. You know what I mean? It's all about how can I help you? So we need to have those resources out here. And even with law enforcement, and I don't know if you know this, but every police district has a victim assistance officer. And we need to tap into those victim assistance officers to say, listen, there was a crime, something occurred. Can you please reach out to this victim, along with the community-based agency, which I do a lot of that with my 4 districts within the Northwest section of Philadelphia. And those victim assistance officers are awesome. We actually go to their home, you know what I mean, to be able to meet with them. We're boots on the ground. And some victims, even with the Asian Americans, are afraid to go to the police station, but they can call 911 from where they are and then make that report and then have the police come. But those are major issues, the language barriers, and then for them to have the fear that they're not going to be treated as the victim. Mm-hmm. Those are major issues that we need to address. And any way that I can help, let me know. So I do know a lot of inspectors, and so in that aspect, I will work with you. Thank you. Now, pre-COVID, racism was alive and well amongst the Asian American communities. And it did get worse. Now the pandemic is dying down a little. Do you see a little decrease?
Not really. I don't see any decrease, to be honest. Because just now we had a staff meeting, and our executive director, John Chen, just talked about this past weekend, there were 3 attacks right in Chinatown. So no, it's not going anywhere as far as we're concerned. And there has been fear, especially among the parents of high school children or children of school age, that once the school district has restart, once the school district restarts the in-person lesson, that these kind of attacks would become worse, either in school or in these public transportation places, like
And
subways.
yeah, and that's scary. So, and if you can touch on that a little bit. So are there, do you know if there are any resources in place for these school age children? Because I can't imagine like some things that they're gonna have to go through.
Yeah. I think let me try to remember. We did meet with somebody in the school district to describe that. Oh, now I remember. I don't know. After the Atlanta shooting in March, there was a rally that happened in Philly,
Mhm.
in which hundreds of people gather to and march on the street, and then it was organized by an organization called Philly Solidarity, and soon after that. Philly Solidarity reached out to the participants who were there that day, and that fear was something that was discussed during that time. And even before the kind of watershed moment with the Atlanta shooting, that people came to together to talk about anti-Asian hate. Even before then, I remember during the pandemic. Because I work with a lot of youth and their parents, so there were a lot of fear in terms of the virus itself, and also going out and not feeling safe that for their kids and for the elderly, especially. Still within the Asian communities, people have been telling the older people not to go out at night. I told my mom, like, don't go out at night. Try not to go out as often if you don't have to. For children, yes, similar children and elderly, but mostly elderly, because a lot of these attacks were targeting the elderly.
It's just it's heartbreaking. So my prayers go out to you, to everyone within the Asian community who has been a victim of a crime. But we are here for you, and we're taking that stand against racism with you. So anything that I can do, let me know. Anybody that I can put you in contact with that I know within the city, I don't know too many people, but I'll be more than happy to do so. I want to end on, what would you tell, or what advice would you have for elected officials, for law enforcement, for community members? What advice would you have for them, and what steps they could take to decrease crime against Asian Americans?
I myself, I really, really want to see some structural changes, right? So we're talking about curriculums in school. Why is it there that we have Asian American Heritage Month, which is May right now?
Mhm.
But then Asian American history is not built as part of the school curriculum, right? It is totally unacceptable. And same for a lot of other communities of color as well. And that's number one. And then number two, if you look at the structural and physical resources that have been given or not given to particular neighborhoods in the city, and this is something that we just talked about in our staff meeting this morning, that why is the lighting so bad and old, and outdated in Chinatown, right? Why are there not enough lighting? Because there's not enough funding. But why isn't that enough funding within this block or a few blocks, this pocket of space right at the center of Center City, right? But when you walk out of Chinatown, the lighting is much better, right? So a lot of these inequities are structural, is built inside the system. And that is true also for mental health. Why is it so hard for people, especially people of color, and especially immigrants who might not speak English, right? Why is it so hard for them to seek help? Uh, why is it so hard to find a therapist or a service provider who have the cultural competency to serve our people, right? There is a lot of lack of resources that that are built inside the system, that has to change before we can effect real change on the ground. Of course, we can educate people, we can put a Band-Aid on the wound, right? And say that, okay, you have to, and put the burden on the victims, like you have to report, you have to do this, you have to do that. But I think what's deeper is that we have to interrogate and understand why individuals don't want to advocate for themselves. It's because the system is not built for them to advocate for themselves.
Wow, that is very powerful. And I will share that information with the elected officials in the Northwest section of Philadelphia. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I pray and hope there will be a brighter day and racism stops. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Melany.
Thank you for joining me today to gain insight on the alarming problem Asian Americans are facing with racism and hate crimes. It is so important that we take a stance together to end racism. Stand with me in spreading love, not hate. Stand with me in respecting others that do not look like you, and also respect others that do look like you. If you are a victim of hate crime, you can contact me, Melany Nelson, the Executive Director at Northwest Victim Services. You can contact me directly at 267-808-0350, and I will be more than happy to help you. Please spread love and not hate to make this world a better place. Peace and blessings.